For nearly 70 years, the Soviet Union was one of the most feared and admired superpowers on the planet. It dominated half of Europe, raced against the United States in the space race, and promised to build a society without inequality. But something went wrong. Or rather, many things went wrong, because the fall of the Soviet Union wasn't an accident, it was a consequence. To understand why the Soviet Union collapsed, we first need to understand why it was born. In the middle of World War I, the Russian Empire collapsed. Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown, and the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, took power with a revolutionary promise to end inequality, abolish private property, and build a socialist society. After the 1917 revolution, Lenin tried to build a communist economy at lightning speed. First, he implemented war communism, which was basically about holding on to power and supplying the Red Army during the war, though at the cost of paralyzing the economy and causing enormous social suffering. Production plummeted. There were famines and chaos. So, in 1921, Lenin changed course and introduced the new economic policy. A mix of socialism with small doses of capitalism that allowed peasants and small merchants to sell freely. And that saved the economy from collapse. Thus, the Soviet Union was born, a federation of republics with Russia as the dominant force. It was the largest communist experiment in history. After Lenin's death, Stalin took power and established an authoritarian regime. Under his rule, the USSR industrialized at a brutal pace, prioritizing heavy industry, electrification, and mass production. Land was expropriated, agriculture was collectivized, and the countryside was forced to meet impossible quotas. This way, the state controlled everything. The USSR emerged as a superpower after World War II, and for many, communism seemed invincible. But the seeds of its downfall were already planted: an inflexible economy, a closed political system, and a regime that didn't tolerate change. What could go wrong, right? They were just trying to redesign all of human society from scratch, without a rough draft. Then came Brezhnev, the leader who ruled for nearly 2 decades, and under whom the USSR began to stagnate without anyone noticing. He was the master of more of the same. During his leadership, the Soviet economy entered a stage known as the period of stagnation. In practice, the economic model no longer worked. The system was rotting in silence while millions stood in line for a bit of bread. Economic growth, which had been strong in the 1950s and 60s, collapsed to nearly zero. Over time, people began to lose faith. Not just in the economic system, but in the promise itself. Another key factor in the USSR's collapse was massive military spending. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union allocated a disproportionate share of its economy to the arms race against the US, building nuclear weapons, maintaining millions of soldiers, and financing proxy wars. The invasion of Afghanistan, launched in 1979, was especially costly. A prolonged, unpopular conflict with no clear victories that drained resources and exhausted the state. Meanwhile, the civilian economy stagnated and people lived with scarcity and social decay. The cost of sustaining a military superpower was literally unsustainable. And so we come to 1985, the year Mikhail Gorbachev took office as General Secretary of the Communist Party. But what seemed like a chance to modernize the country ended up accelerating its disintegration. Even so, his arrival was important because he publicly admitted that the system wasn't working. Instead of covering up the errors, he wanted to confront them. And that is already a revolution in itself. He introduced 2 key reforms that changed everything: Perestroika and Glasnost. Perestroika was a series of restructurings carried out in the economy and politics. What did it propose? Giving state-owned companies autonomy, legalizing small private businesses, and partially reducing state control. But there was a problem. The entire system was designed for the opposite. The economic reforms came too late, poorly coordinated, and within a structure that could no longer support them. What was meant as a fix ended up opening the floodgates of a cracked dam. Production fell. Companies, uncertain about how to manage their new freedom, became less efficient. Inflation soared and shortages increased, reaching over 150% annual inflation. In the Soviet Union, there was no private banking sector. Everything was controlled by the state through the central bank, the Gosbank. One of Gorbachev's measures was to allow monetary and banking reforms. Unregulated cooperative banks were created, which triggered credit and speculation, worsening the financial chaos. This dynamic was one of the final blows to the Soviet economy. Because when a country's currency becomes just printed paper, the entire system goes into collapse mode. Not everything was as bad as it seemed. Glasnost was a political reform that proposed openness, greater freedom of expression, access to information, and public debate. With Glasnost, for the first time, Soviets could openly talk about their problems. The press was no longer just propaganda. Reports on corruption, poverty, and past mistakes were published, even on Stalin's atrocities. Can a system based on censorship survive when the truth starts to come out? Another earthquake was forming inside the USSR as a result of Glasnost. The awakening of national identities. The people started to speak. The Soviet Union was not a homogeneous country. It was made up of 15 republics, many with their own language, culture, history, and above all, their own resentment. Each republic with its own demands. More autonomy, more identity, more independence. Nationalism became an unstoppable force. If every republic wants to govern itself, what's the point of the Soviet Union? Nationalism wasn't a consequence of the Soviet collapse. It was one of its main causes, because when the republic stopped believing in the common project, there was no economy, army, or speech that could hold up the structure. When Gorbachev launched Glasnost and Perestroika, he didn't just want to reform the economy, he also wanted to partially democratize the political system. That meant allowing real, albeit limited, elections, opening debate spaces, and permitting some ideological pluralism. By 1989, opposition movements already existed inside and outside the party, and that year the Soviet Union held historic elections. The party's official candidates were defeated. One of the most symbolic cases was Boris Yeltsin, who won with over 90% of the vote and became a political star. 1990 was the year the Soviet Union began to disassemble before the eyes of the world. It was a year of total crisis. The fall of the USSR was part of a domino effect in Eastern Europe. In 1989, countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany broke with communism. The fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized the end of Soviet control over the socialist bloc. Isolated and without allies, the USSR was weakened and collapse became inevitable. Inspired, the Soviet republics began declaring their sovereignty one by one. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was an act of rupture. Lithuania became the first republic to formally declare independence from the USSR. It was followed by Estonia, Latvia, Georgia, and others. Even the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic declared its sovereignty, led by Boris Yeltsin, who was already an icon of the opposition to the old regime. What did that mean? That Russia itself no longer fully recognized the power of the Central Soviet government. After a year of crisis, 1991 was the Soviet Union's final act. The collapse wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow-motion collapse, which by that year could no longer be stopped. In August, a group of high-ranking government, military, and KGB officials attempted a coup against Gorbachev. But the coup failed within 3 days, and the public took to the streets to defend democracy. The hero who emerged was Boris Yeltsin, who publicly defied the coup plotters and gained popular and military support. After the coup failed, the Communist Party was suspended. Several republics immediately declared independence, and Gorbachev no longer had any real power. In December, Mikhail Gorbachev announced his resignation as president of the USSR. That same day, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place, the Russian tricolor flew. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. The story of the Soviet Union is a powerful reminder that no system is invulnerable. When the economic, political, and social foundations weaken, even the most imposing giant can collapse from within. And although the USSR disappeared over 30 years ago, the lessons from its collapse are still relevant, because understanding its fall helps us better understand the present and maybe even anticipate the future. Leave your opinion in the comments. Do you think the USSR story is a warning or a unique case? If you liked the video, give it a like, subscribe, and turn on the bell for more stories that change the world.